Welcome back to Paris Lesbos. One of us is a pixie, the other gets called Rena. Quick housekeeping announcements first. After almost 4 years of nonstop episodes, we'll be taking a break because I'm exhausted from tight deadlines and it's starting to suck the fun out of something I started with a great deal of enthusiasm as a hobby, and that is still technically just a hobby. Also, I think it's affecting the quality of the episodes you listen to. So we'll be back in September for what I suppose should be called season 2, but that would mean we're doing 4-year-long seasons.
I mean, there's all sorts of unconventional ladies in this podcast. I think we can be unconventional too.
But now back to your regularly scheduled podcast. We're staying in roughly the same orbit this month as we did last month, so you should recognize today's protagonist. She is mainly known to the broader public as the estranged wife or lover of the Belgian poet Maurice Maeterlinck. But our audience will remember her as Margaret Anderson's lover and the woman whose singing made Janet Flanner want to throw herself into the Seine. It's Georgette Leblanc.
What an intro.
As she herself tells it, Georgette was from the French provinces, specifically Rouen, and probably born in early 1869, as she mentions a winter dawn.
But then how many of our women were less than reliable when discussing their birth years and early lives generally?
For Georgette, her family were rich bourgeoisie who discouraged her idea to work in the theater. However, she was allowed to take up artistic pursuits like singing, drawing, and sculpture. She even claims to have won a medal for an artistic contribution to the Salon, a well-known French competition, though she doesn't say if it was in singing, drawing, or sculpture. I assume it was one of the last two, as I haven't heard of any singing submissions to that competition. Still, she further writes that she was the unwanted third child, the afterthought.
Despite being so accomplished.
As we move along in the timeline, tragedy struck when she was 13. Georgette's mother reportedly dropped dead in her daughter's arms as she, the mother, got ready for a ball. Georgette describes her father being inconsolable after his wife died. Around the same time, there is also a supposed fiancé who was refused by her father and therefore poisoned himself in grief.
Wait, when she was 13?
According to Georgette's autobiography, so take it with a grain of salt. As you will see further, good listener, in this episode, Georgette is a rather unreliable narrator and an interesting structure to her autobiography.
All right. Something to look forward to.
At 17, Georgette left for Paris for a possible marriage.
So already we're unsure. What makes this a possible marriage?
Georgette speaks of it, and it does somewhat line up with a bit of confusion over who she was to Maeterlinck in terms of legal paperwork and matrimony later on. But right here at 17, Georgette says there was a suitor who might as well have poofed into existence with the way she introduces this nameless man. Further, she says that he agreed to a pact, her freedom, and an unconsummated marriage.
Interesting. Now, we've mentioned before that she had a long-term husband. Did she like men, or why was she going with this unconsummated marriage?
Oh, she liked men. You can definitely tell that from how she goes on and acts about Maurice once she meets him and even before she meets him.
Ooh, all right. So, what is this? I mean, and the guy agrees to it, or?
So we only have what Georgette says in her autobiography about this. There may be legal paperwork locked somewhere either in France or Spain or possibly in the Vatican, considering it was a Catholic ceremony. But I do not have access to vaults of government papers or religious papers.
Got it. So, I mean, she's pretty young, so maybe it was just she was too young for this, or maybe she didn't like the guy and wanted his money?
She marries him, she says, because she wants her freedom. She wants to be away from her family. She further says that this marriage lasted a year, and that backed by the law, her husband claimed the right to the role of imitation husband it authorized.
What does that mean?
It means he went back on his word, his half of the pact, which was an unconsummated marriage.
So he claimed his role as husband. Ugh.
In the eyes of the law of that time in France. Georgette says after that year she emerged exhausted, covered in bruises, and feeling ill afterwards.
Doesn't sound like he really respected her.
The plot further thickens with a doctor getting a court order for her to be placed in a sanatorium. She also mentions a lawsuit during this time. Initially, I thought this was to refer to a divorce, considering how she gets involved with Maeterlinck later, but I'm a bit uncertain. I will say, as a bit of foreshadowing, if I remember correctly from Leanne de Pougy's episode, the reason she could marry her second husband after she had had a divorce was because her first husband was dead by that point and the Catholic Church considered her to be a widow.
We're seeing some maybe inflexibility with the Catholic Church at that point.
But moving along, about 6 months after the possible divorce and sanatorium scenario, Georgette made her singing debut at age 18 or 20 at the Opéra Comique.
So 18 or 20, it's a pretty broad range there.
It depends if you're taking Georgette's word for it or if you are believing a biographer who was actually talking about someone else, but she appears in that biography.
Got it.
A few months after her debut, she read Maeterlinck's preface to Emerson's book Essays, which led to her abandoning a promising singing career in Paris in order to join Maeterlinck in Belgium.
Wow. So, yeah, she is just at her start. So I guess you're right. She must like men.
Yes, keep in mind, she has not met him yet. He has no idea she exists.
So this is a fully, parasocial relationship. She likes his work, and she has to meet him.
Very true. In order to meet him, she takes an offer to sing at the Théâtre de la Monnaie in Brussels. To do so, she traded a salary of 2,000 francs a month for a salary of 800 francs a month. Quite the pay cut. To meet Maeterlinck, she arranges to attend a dinner party that he was invited to in Brussels. To attract his attention, she also strapped a large blue diamond to her forehead. I'm assuming this is supposed to be set in a headband or tiara, but that biographer Ford doesn't bother to mention anything beyond a large blue diamond on the forehead.
So we're thinking duct tape or...
No, I really do think it's set in some sort of headpiece.
Yeah, those are starting to be a thing. So she has her fancy headband. What does she do to woo this mysterious writer man?
As Georgette tells it in her autobiography, which was translated into English by Janet Flanner, by the way, ignore my excitement on that fact, it was midnight when she entered the gathering of the famous lawyer Edmond Picard in Brussels. No relation to Star Trek's Captain Picard.
Right, he will be born in several centuries.
Now, Georgette had requested to enter last, which she did with that diamond on her forehead which blazed brighter than ever, and had already scandalized Brussels, or so she said. She continues on about her gold-flowered velvet gown and compares herself to Cleopatra as the host, Picard, led her over to the corner where Maurice Maeterlinck was smoking a pipe.
Talk about the entrance.
They then sat opposite each other at dinner, where she stared at him the whole time. Maeterlinck said little and spoke stutteringly. I doubt having a woman staring at him helped. Despite this, they both connected after dinner when she sang some of his poems that had recently been put to music. By the end of the night, they made plans to meet again. Georgette was later puzzled by his lack of a lover as they spent more time together at his house. There were admiring notes from women, but no sign of a mistress or a wife.
Maybe because he's so awkward?
I do not know enough about Maeterlinck to comment.
Fair enough. So they're doing their little thing.
While this affair slowly began, Georgette was appearing in Carmen in 1895. The appearance went well according to herself, so at least she isn't entirely giving up her career to pursue this man.
Yeah, no, Carmen is a big one. So sounds like she is like, for all the sacrifices she made early on to like get there, she is now like fully embracing her career as well.
And now, at an indeterminate time later, and I say indeterminate because Georgette's autobiography jumps around a lot, you will find references to her childhood in the middle of the book. You will find references to 10 years into her life with Maeterlinck at the beginning of the book. It does not necessarily follow a timeline.
Right, kind of a nonlinear narrative.
So I cannot tell you when this occurs. I can only tell you her account of it. Georgette records that she never thought of marrying him at all. She says he brought it up in Paris during a walk through the Bois de la Cambre. Here, she also mentions a marriage of 10 months and a Spanish pseudo-husband. I'm assuming this is in reference to the previous marriage event that we already covered.
Marriage event is one way of putting it.
She says the obstacle here was not divorce, but an annulment from the Vatican, as Spain did not legally have divorce. And then she says that suddenly the world newspapers announced her marriage to Maeterlinck to the surprise of both of them. Don't you just hate it when that happens?
Wild. Is it just they were hanging out together too much and the press were like, well, they have to be married now, right?
I'm assuming it must be like that. I imagine it similar to celebrity gossip and news and reporting from the past century and into this century. Like, how many times do you hear some famous actor is now married or dating so-and-so?
Right. Well, and of course, then also one news source will quote another news source, will quote another news source. And so it's really only one person who made the bad claim and everyone else is just quoting them.
In the case of Georgette and Maeterlinck, I will say that there doesn't appear to be a clear answer in her autobiography as to whether they did marry. She never gives a date or yes or no in her memoirs. To further add to the confusion, some early biographies of him mention her as his wife, but then more modern writers call her his partner and list a different woman as his wife later on. One source, a biography encyclopedia site, does actually include a reason for this, namely that the Catholic Church never gave Georgette a divorce or annulment from her previous husband. And while I am wary of sources that are not books, the reason makes sense, and it does kind of track with what we saw in Leanne de Pougy's life.
Mm-hmm. So, if nothing else, they are long-term partners who are basically married, but maybe not literally. So they're married. What's that look like? What's their relationship like?
So going through the not clear timeline from her memoirs, it appears that by 1898 they were both living in Paris. This may also be the time that he killed her cat 7 years after meeting.
I'm sorry, what?
She says he was exasperated by the noises the cat made prowling in the garden. I suspect it was yowling in heat. Georgette thought he was joking that he would shoot it until he actually shot said cat between the eyes.
Excuse me? Okay. That doesn't sound like a great husband or long-term partner. You know what I mean?
Very true. She doesn't record anything, though, beyond this, so...
Mm-hmm. So who's to say? Maybe they had their great moments and this was just a low point for them.
Yes, there is also the scenario having to jump back, unfortunately, I'm sorry, to about 1893, where Maeterlinck is collaborating with the composer Claude Debussy on the opera Pelléas et Mélisande, which was based on Maeterlinck's play of the same name. And Georgette was supposed to perform the role of Mélisande in the opera's 1902 premiere, but she was replaced. and there was a great falling out then between Maeterlinck and Debussy over this.
Got it. So he's willing to burn some bridges for her.
Definitely. She is very much acknowledged by everyone to be his muse for over a decade.
But you say for over a decade. What happens then?
Well, we're not quite there yet, because I do know that by 1906, instead of living in Paris, they have moved to a villa in Grasse, and by now their relationship is troubled. Maeterlinck pulled away from Georgette and got depressed, which led to health trips to Normandy, where she took walks dressed as an abbess.
Interesting. Do we know why?
I think it might have to do with how she convinced him to buy an abbey for 6,000 francs a year. Well, not really buy, but get a lifelong lease on said abbey.
Got it. Did she have like a thing for religious institutions?
Not that I could discern, and since the dead never answer my phone calls, I cannot tell you for certain.
We will live with this mystery forever. Okay, so
I think it had to do with her enjoyment of the theater and pretending.
Yeah, it's a very dramatic role. So she dresses as an abbess. He's depressed. How does this go?
Well, soon after, she was no longer his muse, at least according to critics. And unfortunately for her, Maeterlinck met his future wife in 1910. I don't think getting to briefly play the role of Melisande opposite Sarah Bernhardt's Pelleas in about 1911 to 1914 was a good consolation prize from Georgette's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that she finally gets the role, but oof.
And, dear listener, if you are wondering about that large time gap, it is because rather than put an exact date, Georgette only refers to it being right before Sarah Bernhardt has her leg amputated, but that occurs later than a year after 1910, so later than 1911, and I am not certain if I believe Georgette's recollection of timing.
Yeah, no. And now we're dealing with two women who are a bit hazy on timing, so she's splitting up with her husband.
Yes, the rupture between Georgette and Maeterlinck may have been further fueled by her supposedly preventing him from joining the French Foreign Legion in 1914 at the outbreak of World War I.
Oh, how dare she think of his safety?
In her memoirs, she says that she called the mayor of Rouen in order to get the mayor to prevent her lover from joining. Then she says that she convinced the mayor or someone else that her lover should only help via his skill with a pen, meaning writing. In the end, his application was declined. However, Maeterlinck was over 50 years old at the time, so I think his age had more to do with it than the story she tells.
Yeah, that would also make sense.
As to what Georgette ended up doing during the Great War, she, like many of our women and others of the time, helped the medical side. She offered her abbey to the Red Cross as a hospital. Unfortunately, the German advance meant they had to abandon the abbey. Further, it's unclear to me if Georgette took another lover during the war. There's a section of her memoirs where she says, "Often a telegram from the other called me close to the front. He was wounded several times, and I went to him, no matter where, through any danger."
Ooh, the other? Who is this mysterious other? What do we know about him?
That she never mentions his name. However, after that quote, there does follow a description of train rides, waiting at infirmaries in the rain in order to be allowed in, and then there's a passage about her being operated on for some illness, which is also not named, before further saying that she lost her great love. The whole section is difficult to interpret because it jumps so much. I am assuming the great love is supposed to be the nameless man from the hospital 7 pages back. I mean, it could be referring to Maeterlinck because her relationship with him does end by 1918, a year before he married.
They were dragging this out.
Yeah, they did drag it out. But again, I don't know which man her great love is supposed to be. In terms of the breakup with Maeterlinck, His last telegram to her prior to leaving for his American lecture tour in 1918 read, "Useless to come. Everything finished between us."
Wow, he broke up with her via text.
He also did not tell her of his subsequent marriage. She says she heard it from a mutual acquaintance instead. She also lost the Abbey along with him.
Oh, not the Abbey, come on. Insult to injury.
The lease was through him, not her, so. Now, Georgette is not entirely ruined by this. She had continued her singing career and performed in operas throughout the relationship. But from what we saw in Margaret Anderson's episode, it does not appear that she was ever good with money. And speaking of Margaret Anderson, the two meet in about 1920 in New York. Despite being 20 years younger than Georgette, Margaret was in love at first sight, while Georgette was more reserved. I believe I made a comment about bird mating dances of flashing wings quickly for comparison to Margaret's enthusiasm and flamboyance.
Yeah, now, we haven't yet mentioned any relationships with women. Had Georgette had any relationships with women before this?
I found no recordings of such. It's entirely possible, and then she just never mentioned it, but...
No, because it sounds like she was circumspect when it came to lovers.
Maybe because the world decided she was Maeterlinck's wife.
She's French. I mean, she had to move around a bit for war reasons, I'm sure, but how's she in New York?
Georgette had been lured there on a promise from Hearst newspapers about payment for her memoirs.
Oh, okay.
From that mention, I assume she had begun writing it before she even met Margaret Anderson, though the reason they end up published is in part through a plan that she and Margaret created later on. Now, back in the early 20s, from there, she moved along with Margaret to New Jersey for the summer and then returned to the city after 2 months because living in the woods at a makeshift artist commune did not work out.
No, that sounds unpleasant, but to each their own.
Then we again encounter the mystic philosopher Georgiev, who they, along with Jane Heap, follow to Paris in 1923.
Ah, this guy again.
Don't worry, I'm not going to be reciting any passages of him trying to talk about fleas or women's digestive issues.
Good.
If you are confused, there are previous episodes where he makes similar comments to other of our subjects, or you will probably find, I believe it's under Salita Solano's episode, the book that is the records of several meetings of his mystic philosopher group in Paris in the interwar years. And you can see the very odd comparisons he made.
But anyway, so it's been a while since we've talked about what she does. Is she out there singing? What's she up to?
During the 20s, Georgette appeared in a few films.
Ooh.
One of them was L'Inhumaine in 1924, where she plays the lead role of the fictional famous singer Claire Lescaut. Now, I could not find a description of it in her autobiography or in the biography by Ford, so we're going to go with the synopsis from IMDb, which reads, Claire Lescaut is a famous prima donna. All men want to be loved by her. Among them is the young scientist Einar Norsen. When she mocks him, he leaves her house with the declared intention to kill himself. But the story is much less important than the scenery. This movie, intended to be a manifesto of the modern decorative arts.
Great.
I can believe that, judging from the film poster that the site showed. Still, as we saw in the previous episode, Georgette and Margaret remain short on cash. They moved in with Georgette's sister in Normandy at a drafty chateau. The biographer Hugh Ford isn't certain if they could actually afford to move out or were just sick of the people they lived with, but soon after, Margaret and Georgette left the chateau for Paris and a series of small hotels. They also dreamed up the idea to support themselves via writing, which is how we get Georgette's memoirs, Souvenirs, My Life with Maeterlinck. Alas, sales on debut in 1932 were not enough, and the two ended up living in a peasant's cottage in the countryside after a brief stay at Gurdjieff's institute. During this time, Georgette continued to write, though most of her books were written before this period. Before you ask, Pixie, I didn't find much about them beyond them being children's books and travelogues.
Huh. But it sounds like she did, produce quite a lot for that plan of making money by writing.
Some of them, I think, were created before that plan, possibly even before she met Margaret, if the list I found of publication dates is correct.
Huh, okay. So she's been a writer the whole time. It's just been kind of low-key because she has this, big singing career and lover of a great writer career.
Yes, now, unfortunately, things do not improve as the 1930s draw to a close. Georgette discovered a swelling in her arm, which turned out to be a tumor. A doctor allegedly removed it at the start of World War II, but the cancer was not gone. Speaking of World War II, Georgette and Margaret do not flee France. They end up in Vichy to the south, the not exactly independent southern part of France, during the German occupation. They live a few miles from the Spanish border in case they need to flee through Spain to the US later on. Since she had the supposed operation and the doctor claimed to remove the tumor, Georgette did not know for 2 years how bad her condition was until she begins to deteriorate here. Georgette was working on a book at this time as well, La Machine à Courage, quite the title considering what was happening in her life, and oddly, she actually wrote about her death in it. She compared it to watching herself tear away from her body or the core of her being and throwing it to a new beginning.
Wow. I mean, you do hear about people with, illnesses like that, writing as a way to come to terms with their death.
The book would be published in 1947, but Georgette would not see it. She would see a last trip to Cannes, though, during which she rallied a bit. The rally didn't last long. Georgette would die in October 1941 at probably age 72, with Margaret holding a picture of Gurdjieff against Georgette's cheek and giving her a last message from him where he calls her brave and a friend. Her response was, "He said that? Then we shall die without dying." Now, I'm certain I've missed something here from his talks with them, but if you've heard the last several episodes, then you know how confused I am by this man and what he says.
Yeah, he's generally a confusing guy.
Now, Georgette Leblanc today is mainly remembered for her ties to Maurice Maeterlinck and to Margaret Anderson. I didn't find any biographies specifically dedicated to her alone beyond her own writing. There may be one in the depths of France that the internet didn't dredge up for me. If so, it may be sitting on a shelf in some old bookstore or antique shop.
But regardless, it sounds like she lived quite an extraordinary life.
Thanks for listening. You can find us on your favorite podcatcher or follow us on Twitter or over on the YouTube community tab as we search for a Twitter replacement. And yes, I do refuse to call it X. To repeat from the beginning of this episode, we'll be taking a break. You can feel free to continue giving suggestions for future episodes during that time. We'll be back in September. In the meantime, remember, if your partner breaks up with you via Telegram, don't wallow. Just take up with the publisher of a literary magazine and follow a strange mystic.